Hello everyone. Today we'll discuss about an important topic. It's about the economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic. It's been already 2.5 years since the COVID-19 pandemic started. So we now have some knowledge about what is the impact on different sectors, on different economies, and we have some numbers to actually analyze as to what exactly was the cost of the pandemic. It's not yet fully over, but we still have some estimated impact of the economic impact of COVID-19, and we have some numbers, some graphs from different sources. We will discuss those things in today's live session. So Cambridge University came up with this estimate that the global economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic is around 82 trillion US dollar over 5 years. That's massive, right? 82 trillion. Just to put that into perspective, the US GDP is around 20 to 25 trillion. So that's like 4 times the US GDP, annual GDP. So that's massive, right? And then you have an estimated 40 million jobs were lost. Many jobs have been recovered since then, but some of the permanent jobs will never be recovered. So the estimated number of jobs which were lost during this last 2.5 years is about 40 millions across industry, and this is globally. Okay, so numbers are global numbers, not just for a given country. And there's a massive increase in the debt. So debt is quite high in many countries. Many countries are debt-ridden, including some of the developed countries also in Europe. Quite debt-ridden now. So debt to GDP has increased massively in the last few years. Because if many countries do not have money, they were borrowing from internationally, and that has increased the debt. And around 6 to 8% drop in the GDP in European Union alone, and at around 7% globally. So that's massive. And not to forget the loss, the human loss, the life losses. Estimated 15 million people have died in the pandemic. So 15 million excess deaths worldwide in 2.5 years. And because of that also, there are some secondary impact on different economic sectors. Lot of skilled people died, a lot of doctors died, many frontline people, like people who worked in the hospitality industry, people who worked in aviation, in civil services, in healthcare died. And it's very difficult to replace those positions because when so many people have died, skilled people have died, it's difficult to replace them so easily, and it's becoming difficult for countries to and many sectors to actually get those skilled people back in. And so that is an indirect way of economic impact. All that has been factored into the total impact, which is about 82 trillion over 5 years. So here the global growth of GDP. So you see here, right, the global growth of GDP were almost like about 4 to 6% for majority of the time since 1971. But there have been some years where there's a massive drop. For example, this is Second World War, right, in the 40s, right, 40 to 45. So there was a massive drop in the world's GDP during the Second World War between 1939 to 45. So this is exactly what you see here. Then in 31 as well, that's when the Great Depression happened. So massive drop in global GDP again. I think in 20s also, I think that was First World War. I'm not good with the history. I think that was the time of First World War. Then also global GDP decreased. There were also few years where the global GDP growth was negative. For example, once in 1970s, and again during early part of 1980s. And then the global GDP again was the growth was negative in 2007 and 8 financial crisis. So that's this part. And then in 2020, when the pandemic started, the COVID-19 pandemic started, it was estimated that it will be negative. The global growth in GDP will be negative, and yes, it has come out to be negative. Okay, so this is the GDP growth, to put it into perspective historically, and you see that in the last 60-70 years, right, since the Second World War, this is 2020 was the worst year for the entire world in terms of the GDP growth. It turned out to be a negative 4%, which is massive, 4.5%, I guess, which is massive compared to the previous ones in 70s and 80s. And I think the last time it was worse was in 40s, 40 to 45 during the Second World War. And in 2020, the pandemic year, here is the impact across different economies in the world. You see here in Asia, in Latin American, in world over, in China, United States, you see the highest being in the Asia part. But I think this excludes China for no reason I understand. Maybe the data for China is not available, but this seems to be. So the highest was in Asia. Worldwide, it was about 4% negative GDP. Or China separately is given. Okay, makes sense, right? China is such a big economy. So China's economic growth was negative again, but somewhere around 1.5%. United States growth was negative, but it wasn't very bad as expected. It was around negative 1%, which is quite impressive in my view. But especially the Asian economies were hugely impacted. This is the impact on the US economy, and here is the put it in a historical perspective. You see the economic impact in 2007 and 8 in financial crisis, right? But there again, in 2018 there was also, it's quarterly, by the way, right? This data is quarterly. So there have been some quarters even after the financial crisis. For example, sometime in 2011 and sometime in 2013, the GDP growth, quarterly GDP growth was negative for the US economy, and it was so bad, about negative 4.8% in the first quarter of 2020. So that was so bad. So this is the last part, the red one. Then you have the US unemployment rate claim. So it's like the money unemployment allowance paid to people. In the 70s, this is the data from 1970s to 20 lows, about 50 years of data, and you see it's so low, right? But this has shot up to very, very high number. This is just this steep. So this is insane, right? That's because many people lost their job. Restaurants were shut down. Hospitality industry was it's virtually shut down. Many people working in stores and retail stores, in restaurant chains, and in those places lost their jobs. So they were fully dependent on the unemployment allowance from the government, and that's why. And this has never happened usually in last 50, 60, 70 years in the US history. Then there was huge impact on different sectors, but there's a bit of a variation actually. Some sectors were impacted more than the others. For example, the aviation sector was hugely impacted, massive impact on the aviation compared to, say, for example, entertainment, because there was some form of entertainment, especially the online entertainment. There was a huge increase. The technology industry actually benefited. It was the opposite of that. But some industry, for example, hospitality industry was impacted quite hugely. So here is the drop in the oil prices. In 2020, there was a massive drop. I think in the first quarter of 2020, the February itself, when it wasn't even a pandemic, it just started in Wuhan in China. In that period, actually, the oil prices just dropped massively. Here you see, oil prices dropped massively. And then here is the impact on the food and agri. There was a big crisis, actually, food and agri during the pandemic, actually, especially in the African countries, where many countries were in famine. So people didn't have food to eat, actually, in many countries, especially in Africa. And here you see the ones in red are the ones who were hugely impacted by the pandemic. Only the sector food and agri is represented here, okay, not the other sectors. And there were other things. For example, there's a huge increase in the fertilizer prices starting from 2021 to 2020. The last time there was such a huge increase in the fertilizer prices were during the financial crisis, during 2007 to 9, in these 2 years. But in 2021 and 2022, you see the increase in the fertilizer prices. There's a massive increase, like threefold increase, in fact. So that has an impact on the food prices. So now what we are experiencing in 2022. So the food price index has gone up. You see, it was quite moderate, like for a long time, pretty constant, actually, since 2006. Maybe there was some impact in 2007 and 8, but not a huge impact. But from 2021 onwards, you see a sharp increase in the food price index. All commodities, you take it, whether it's meat or dairy products, cereals and oils and sugar, there is a sharp increase. And then, of course, even in commodity prices. We are experiencing a sharp increase in the commodity prices, and in fact, because of that, we see now a huge increase in the inflation rate across the globe, in the US, in almost all European countries, in Asia, and in almost even in Africa. So, and part of the reason is because of the increase in the commodity prices, including the oil. And you have impact on manufacturing and some of the other industry. Manufacturing was quite heavily impacted, because unlike in, for example, the technology sector, where people can work from home, they can work remotely, manufacturing, that's not possible. And if you remember, during the crisis, Elon Musk, who is the head of Tesla Motors, was very unhappy with this lockdown, because he could not operate the Tesla factories, and they had made some commitment to deliver Tesla cars, and they were not able to meet the expectation, simply because they were shut down, like in the US, and people are not allowed to come to work, and manufacturing industry, where people cannot work remotely, got impacted quite massively. And some of the car companies, literally they had to shut down factories for many months, including the big companies like Ford and General Motors and so on, and Chrysler. Not just in the US, also in the Europe. For example, the German auto industry, which is quite famous in the world, was hugely impacted as well. However, like for instance, the manufacturing industry, there was some impact, but they also got benefited, because in entertainment industry, you actually can have the business model had to be changed a bit. Some of the companies, for example, Disney, for example, from offline business, they massively shifted to online. They have Disney Plus now, and they're making a lot of money out of those online. Because of pandemic, actually, the consumer preference for entertainment actually changed from physical events, the live events. It got changed to streaming services. So Netflix and Disney Plus and Spotify, they they were the beneficiary of that. But however, there were a lot of issues also with a lot of things happened. For instance, the cinema industry got affected a lot. The big screen, sports events didn't happen, so there were also massive losses there. Now retail, retail was the first one, perhaps one of the first industry to get impacted, because majority of the retail squares were closed for months. There was a 60% downfall in March 2020 actually. People simply weren't going out. Many people lost jobs, and many retail stores had to be shut down. In the UK, in Europe, and in the US as well. Transportation industry got impacted. This is an industry which is, in fact, is a lifeline for any economy. Right? If there is no transportation, then the economy will get impacted massively. All sectors will get impacted, because you name it, right? Whether it's manufacturing, whether it's retail, whether it's aviation, whether it's tourism and everything. Most of the industries in an economy depend on transportation. And because of the pandemic, because there was shortage of staff members, because of regulations around transporting things from one place to the other, quarantine rules and other things, because of that, this industry was massively impacted. This is an industry that does not get much of an attention in the media, so you won't read much about transportation in the business newspapers, but this has a very, very important role to play in an economy. And you see here the massive in the global container freight index, and that really increased in 2020, and it continues to be the case. And because it's becoming a bit better, but still not at the pre-pandemic level. So it's still an issue, right? Labor shortage, for example, is a huge issue in this industry at the moment. Aviation industry, it goes without saying that it was one of the industry that was impacted by the pandemic the most, I think. Flights were cancelled. People didn't want to fly, even after there was some relaxation, because people were afraid of flying. Many airlines were in the verge of being bankrupt. So that was, you see the numbers here, right? In 2020, you see a huge downfall. In 2022, there's a huge increase. But 2020 is not a full figure. So, but still, quite hugely impacted. All right. So that was in brief about the impact of COVID-19 on different sectors. There's amazing, documentary on this by DW, the Deutsche Welle, and we can watch that. Actually, I feel it's worth watching that.
But it's also cost a lot of money to maintain the current economic system.
So this is about the economic impact.
Our focus on this edition of the COVID-19 special. What impact has the pandemic had on worldwide poverty? And what are its economic and social costs? What lies ahead? We report from Uganda and Mexico. But first, we take a look at the situation in Ukraine. Millions of people are fleeing the war. Families, women, and children are seeking shelter in neighboring countries, and people in many places are pitching in to help. But what does that look like in the middle of a pandemic? Will the infection rates in Ukraine spin out of control again, and in other countries where people are finding shelter? We speak with epidemiologist Berit Lange of the Helmholtz Center for Infection Research in Braunschweig, Germany. She's taken stock of the medical situation in Ukraine and in surrounding countries.
Danke, dass Sie sich die Zeit nehmen.
Thank you for joining us. Could you briefly outline the COVID-19 situation in Ukraine before the Russian invasion?
Der Russen dort war.
Guten Tag, hallo.
Hello. The data we have from Ukraine shows that the country did experience a very big wave of the Omicron variant in January and February. It hit perhaps a little earlier than it did here in Germany. Similar to many other countries, it didn't lead to an overly heavy burden on the healthcare system or to high death rates. But obviously there was an increase in the number of hospital cases and death rates. That was before the war started. Right now, of course, we don't have any up-to-date figures from Ukraine because of the war. And now, going forward, it's very difficult to predict how the situation will develop. What kind of measures need to be taken now to prevent infection rates from spinning out of control? Not just in Ukraine, but also in other countries that Ukrainians have fled to. It's important to ensure as far as possible that the situation of those who've decided to leave isn't made even more difficult by infectious disease. I think the decisive factor is to ensure that the refugees have access to medical care generally. That applies to the neighbouring countries that are taking in refugees. And we here in Germany can certainly help with that. We have aid organisations that can go there. We can support those organisations financially. And then we also need to ensure that the refugees who've come to us directly get proper medical care too. Finally, are you worried that this mass exodus of refugees, and we don't know how many people it will be yet, could give rise to another wave of infections in Europe? I really don't think that needs to be our concern right now. In Germany, we have all the tools we need to deal with COVID. We don't need to worry that refugees will cause surges in infections. I certainly don't expect that.
You can use Monday.com to boost your team's efficiency, and I'm going to show you how in 4.
Thank you, Berit Lange, epidemiologist from the Helmholtz Center for Infection Research.
The war in Ukraine could unleash a hunger crisis in Africa. The country is one of the main suppliers of wheat and corn. And the African continent is already suffering from the economic effects of the pandemic. But in most countries, there are far too few vaccines available and a shortage of medications. Hospital bills are another burden. As a result, many people in Uganda risk falling into poverty.
When Aaron Samba was diagnosed with COVID-19, he could not be admitted to a private hospital in Kampala. He failed to raise the required upfront payment of about $2,000 until a friend convinced a small private clinic to treat him on credit.
They wanted a deposit or upfront payment before even they could admit you for care, which I did not have at that particular time. If you didn't have the 5M or 10M, maybe you deposit a land title, like as security for them to treat you. In fact, in case you fail to pay, they take the land title.
Less than 1 in 10 Ugandans have any health insurance at all. And when the public healthcare system was overwhelmed by rising coronavirus rates, many people could not afford private hospitals. Some were forced to mortgage their property to afford treatment.
The private hospitals had to make a kill out of the pandemic. So it isn't surprising when you hear of the different stories of holding on to bodies, people having to ensure that they first have to give in either car logbooks or house titles or things like that.
Sise Kagaba says she spent more than $50,000 on medical bills for her parents. She lost both of them in a span of just 2 weeks.
You go pay 20 million today, then 2 days later they're bringing another bill. Now you've paid 20, 2 days later they're bringing another bill that has 14 million, and you're thinking, no, maybe my mathematics is wrong. 3 days later they're giving another one of 7, then 4 days later you're getting another one of 18. So it was just crazy.
The World Bank reports that the pandemic has pushed over 40 million Africans into extreme poverty. Economists warn that the socio-economic impact on developing countries like Uganda could even be more severe over the long term.
It's a dominoes effect. We are not only going to struggle economically, we are going to struggle in each and every sector. The service providers who are not picking their money, we are going to have on and off court cases. So people are going to sell off all they had. People are going to go into prison. People are going to be stressed. We shall have suicide, people committing suicide. We shall have depression. We shall have non-communicable diseases. And that's all health.
Healthcare experts report that mental illness rates are on the rise. Many families and individuals are struggling to cope with the losses they've suffered.
For me, it's the psychological torture which most people never think about, because I think I personally had suicidal thoughts because I'm thinking, if both my parents are gone, what am I doing here? So close yourself in a room, scream, but it still doesn't really make sense. I mean, eventually I got people who were able to counsel me, but it just doesn't go away. It's one of the things that continuously comes up.
Very sorry. Official figures show that around 20% of Ugandans have been vaccinated. COVID-19 cases have dropped significantly and the economy has reopened. Tourists are slowly returning and the nighttime curfew has been lifted. Schools have reopened. Now that Uganda has ended what was the world's longest school closure. But teachers are worried. Some students may not return to class.
It's going to be a very big impact as I put it, because these children, as I've said, some have produced, some are mothers, some are carrying.
Uganda is now restructuring policies to support homegrown solutions, including supporting local researchers in the healthcare system.
Building your own research facilities isn't easy. From the moment that COVID vaccines became available, many have been urging a global patent waiver, along with the transfer of know-how and technology. Then developing countries could produce their own vaccines. But critics say that many pharmaceutical companies are putting profit over human lives, leading to vaccine shortages in many countries and making it harder to get the pandemic under control.